The smell of sulfur still clung to Jubilee's denim jacket, a pungent reminder of the night her life went up in smoke. Just 48 hours ago, she had been dancing at the outdoor concert in Santa Monica, the bass thumping in her chest, her hands thrown up in joy. She remembered the rush, the electric tingle in her fingertips, and then the blinding flash of pyrotechnic plasma that wasn't part of the show. The screaming crowd, the fleeing friends, the burning stage rigging, it all replayed in a loop behind her sunglasses. Now, the silence of the black limousine was deafening. Across from her sat an old man in a wheelchair, his bald head gleaming softly in the ambient light of the vehicle's interior. He had introduced himself as Charles Xavier, a man who spoke with a kindness that felt invasive, as if he understood fears she hadn't yet voiced. He had promised her parents that he could help, that his school in Westchester was a sanctuary for healing. "You are safe now, jubilation," Charles said, his voice steady. "The world is changing. People are afraid of what they do not understand, but here, you will learn that your gift is not a curse." Jubilee pulled her yellow trench coat tighter around herself. "My parents just wanted me gone," she muttered, looking out the tinted window as the iron gates of a massive estate rolled open. "They think I'm a bomb waiting to go off." "They want you to learn control," Charles corrected gently. "And perhaps, in time, they will learn acceptance." The mansion was intimidating, a sprawling castle of brick and ivy that looked more like a museum than a school. As the driver unloaded her neon-colored luggage, Charles gestured toward the massive oak doors. "Welcome to the school for gifted youngsters. Please, feel free to explore the grounds before orientation. I must attend to a family matter." Jubilee watched him wheel away toward a private elevator, leaving her standing in a foyer that smelled of old paper and lemon polish. The place was quiet, likely because classes were in session. Needing to clear her head, she wandered down a long, wood-paneled hallway that led toward the back gardens. She pushed open a glass door and stepped onto a stone patio. Sitting on a bench near a rose bush was a boy who looked about her age, though his energy felt far more fragile. He wore loose, teal hospital scrubs that contrasted sharply with the manicured surroundings. His dark hair stood up in a rigid, vertical style, defying gravity. He was rocking slightly back and forth, staring at a butterfly with an intensity that suggested he was trying to dissect it with his mind. "Hey," Jubilee said, stepping closer. "You a student here?" The boy jumped, his eyes darting to her, then to the space above her left shoulder, then back to her eyes. "No, yes, maybe," he stammered. He rubbed his temples aggressively. "The noise is loud today. Are you loud? You look loud." Jubilee cracked a small, hesitant smile. "My outfit. Yeah, I guess I'm Jubilee." "David," the boy whispered, looking down at his scrub pants. "David Haller, or, well, mostly David right now. The others are arguing about the lunch menu." He looked up, his expression shifting from fear to a timid curiosity. "My dad runs this place. He's trying to fix me, says I'm sick, says the things I can do are just symptoms." "Symptoms of what?" Jubilee asked, sensing a kinship in his brokenness. "Of the cracks in the glass," David said cryptically, tapping his forehead. "I broke the world when Mom died. Now I have to glue it back together. Dad Charles, he thinks therapy and pills work, but the voices, they have superpowers, Jubilee, and they don't like the pills." Jubilee sat on the other end of the bench. "Well, I shoot fireworks out of my hands when I get excited, so voices seem pretty manageable compared to arson." David chuckled, a dry, brittle sound. "You'd be surprised." They sat in silence for a moment, two fractured pieces of a puzzle trying to find their edges. Movement in the periphery caught Jubilee's eye. She looked up toward the second story of the mansion, near the dormitories. A window was open. A woman with blue skin and red hair was scaling the side of the building with unnatural agility. She wasn't wearing the school uniform or teacher's attire. She wore a tactical white dress. The figure paused, glancing down. For a split second, her yellow eyes locked onto Jubilee's, cold and calculating, before she slipped through the window and vanished into the boys' dormitory hall. Jubilee blinked, rubbing her sunglasses. "David," she whispered, nudging the boy who was now arguing quietly with himself. "Does this school have a blue lady who climbs walls?" David looked up, his eyes glazing over with a sudden violet energy. "Blue? No, blue is sad. Red is angry, the intruder is deceptive." He clutched his head. "Someone isn't who they say they are." Jubilee stood up, the spark of adventure overriding her fear. "I think we need to go see where she went." The urge to chase the blue-skinned intruder was immediate, a spark lighting up Jubilee's nervous system like one of her own fireworks. but reality intervened in the form of a ruby quartz visor. Before Jubilee could drag David toward the dormitory window, the glass door to the patio slid open with a pneumatic hiss. A tall man stood there, his presence commanding despite his casual sweater vest. The red tint of his glasses hid his eyes, but the set of his jaw suggested he missed very little. "David," the man said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Dr. Gray is waiting for you in the solarium. You're 10 minutes late." David flinched, his vertical hair trembling as if caught in a static field. "Right, the doctor, the red head. She wants to talk about the mother, the ending." He stood up, smoothing his teal scrubs with frantic hands. He glanced at Jubilee, a look of shared panic passing between them before he shuffled past the man. "And you must be Jubilation," the man continued, turning his attention to her. "I'm Scott Summers. Professor Xavier asked me to get you settled in before the orientation assembly. Welcome to the family." Jubilee hesitated, looking back at the window where the blue woman had vanished. It was empty now. "Yeah, thanks. Mr. Summers, do you guys have a lot of climbing clubs here?" Scott offered a tight, practiced smile. "We have a danger room for athletics. We prefer students keep off the masonry. Come along." The solarium was bathed in golden afternoon light, designed to be calming, but to David, it felt like an interrogation room made of glass. He sat on a plush chair, picking at a loose thread on his knee. Across from him sat Jean Grey. She radiated a psychic warmth that made David's skin crawl. It was too invasive, too loud against the cacophony already screaming in his head. "David," Jean said softly, leaning forward, "your father tells me you've been having trouble sleeping again. The nightmares about the hospital." "Not nightmares," David muttered, his eyes darting to the empty corners of the room where he saw people Jean couldn't. "Rehearsals. Cindy wants to burn the curtains. Jack wants to bend the bars. They don't like the pills, Dr. Gray. The pills make the walls of the playroom too thick." Jean sighed, scribbling on a notepad. "David, we've discussed this. These personalities, Cindy, Jack, the others, they are dissociation mechanisms. Your mind created them to cope with the trauma of your mother's death. They aren't real people, and they certainly don't have superpowers." David looked up, his expression hardening into a sudden, terrifying lucidness. "That's what Dad says. He thinks I'm broken. He thinks if he glues the pieces together, he gets a son back." David leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "But I'm not a vase, Jean. I'm a kaleidoscope. You turn the dial and the pattern changes, and every pattern has teeth." Jean frowned, reaching out with a gentle telepathic probe to soothe his amygdala, but she hit a wall, a psychic barrier of adamantium strength that shouldn't have been possible for a traumatized teenage boy. She pulled back, rubbing her temple. "We're going to work on grounding techniques today, David. Just try to stay in the room with me." Meanwhile, the grand hall was buzzing with the chaotic energy of 100 hormonal teenagers who could walk through walls, freeze water, or shoot lasers from their eyes. Jubilee stood near the back, feeling woefully underdressed in her yellow trench coat amidst the sea of spandex and leather. Hank McCoy, a blue-furred giant in a lab coat, was adjusting a microphone on the stage. "If I could have everyone's attention. Welcome to a new semester at Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters. I am Professor McCoy. Please, refrain from phasing through the floorboards during the lecture." "He is a funny one, yeah." Jubilee jumped as a voice appeared directly beside her ear. In a puff of sulfurous smoke, a boy materialized. He had indigo fur, 3 fingers on each hand, and a pointed tail that twitched happily behind him. "Whoa, personal space, Fuzzy," Jubilee gasped, stepping back. The boy grinned, revealing slightly pointed teeth. "Apologies, I am Kurt Wagner. You are the new girl, Jubilee, yes, the one with the sparkles." "Fireworks," she corrected, adjusting her sunglasses. "And you're a teleporter." "Nightcrawler," he said with a theatrical bow. "And this is Sean." A boy with messy red hair and a distinct lack of blue fur stumbled up next to them, holding a tray of cookies. "How you doin'?" he asked, his Irish accent thick. "Don't mind Kurt, he likes to show off. I'm Sean. Banshee if we're using the code names, though I haven't earned my stripes yet." "Code names?" Jubilee asked, raising an eyebrow. "Is this a school or a spy movie?" "With the X-Men, it is often both," Kurt whispered conspiratorially. As Hank McCoy droned on about genetic responsibility and the importance of perseverance in a world that feared them, Jubilee's attention drifted. She scanned the balcony level of the hall. Movement caught her eye. There, lurking in the shadows of the upper colonnade, was the blue woman. Jubilee froze. This wasn't Mystique's natural form, but a shimmering transition. For a split second, the blue skin rippled and shifted into the likeness of a red-headed student, maybe one of the senior girls. But the eyes remained yellow for a fraction of a second too long before turning green. The figure looked down, locking eyes with Jubilee. A finger rose to lips that were reshaping themselves. SHHH. Then the figure turned and walked briskly toward the administrative wing, the direction of the headmaster's office. She's real, Jubilee breathed. Who is real? Sean asked, munching on a cookie. The intruder, Jubilee said, grabbing her bag. I have to go. She bolted from the assembly, ignoring McCoy's call for order. She sprinted down the hallway, her sneakers squeaking on the polished wood. She needed a witness. She needed someone who knew the crazy truth. She rounded a corner and collided hard with David, who was just exiting the solarium, looking pale and shaken. David, Jubilee grabbed his shoulders, steadying him. I saw her, the blue lady, she's inside. She changed her face, David, like magic. David blinked, his eyes unfocused. Face, chain, like a mask, or like a new personality taking the light. Like a shapeshifter, Jubilee hissed. She's heading toward your dad's office. We can't handle this. You said she was deceptive. If she can look like anyone, she could hurt him. David's demeanor shifted. The timidity vanished, replaced by a rigid fear for his father. Charles, she's going to Charles. We need to tell him, now, Jubilee urged, before she gets close. David nodded, a sudden determination setting his jaw. Run. Together, the firework girl and the boy of 1,000 voices took off down the corridor, rushing toward the heavy oak doors of the headmaster's study to warn the most powerful telepath on Earth that he was not alone. The heavy oak doors of the headmaster's office loomed at the end of the corridor like the gates to a fortress. Jubilee didn't slow down. Her sneakers squeaked violently against the parquet floor, a high-pitched prelude to their arrival. Beside her, David Haller panted, his hospital scrubs flapping around his thin frame, his vertical hair cutting through the air like a shark fin. We have to just go in, Jubilee gasped, her hand reaching for the brass handle. No knocking. Knocking is for people who aren't chasing shapeshifters. David looked terrified, his eyes darting to the unseen figures hovering in his peripheral vision. Knocking is polite. Cindy says it's rude to barge in. The angry one wants to kick the door down. I don't know who to listen to. Listen to me, Jubilee shouted, gripping the handle and shoving her shoulder against the wood. The doors swung open with a dramatic groan, banging against the interior walls. Jubilee stumbled into the room, sparks fizzing from her fingertips in sheer agitation. Professor, you have to listen. There's a... The words died in her throat. The office smelled of old books, mahogany, and something metallic, like the air before a lightning strike. Charles Xavier sat behind his massive desk, his hands clasped calmly in his lap. But he wasn't alone. Sitting in the visitor's chair, with a posture that made the furniture look like a throne, was a man in a muted gray suit. A dark helmet rested on his knee, its T-shaped opening staring blankly at the intruders. The man turned slowly, his eyes sharp and cold, carrying the weight of a history Jubilee couldn't even begin to unpack. Several metal pens on Xavier's desk were floating in midair, rotating in a lazy, impossible orbit. Dad, David breathed, shrinking back against the doorframe. And the metal man, he's loud. His head is very loud. Charles Xavier sighed, the floating pens gently settling back into their cup. David, jubilation. I was under the impression that orientation had finished, not that it had evolved into a stampede. We saw her, Jubilee blurted out, stepping past David to stand her ground, though the presence of the gray-suited man made the hairs on her arms stand up. A blue woman, in the hall. She shifted her face, Professor. She turned into a student. We thought she was coming for you. The man in the chair chuckled, a low, dry sound devoid of humor. A shapeshifter, you say? How imaginative. The youth today have such vibrant paranoia. Eric, please, Xavier said softly, raising a hand. He looked at Jubilee, his expression serious. A blue woman. Yes, Jubilee insisted. Scaly skin, yellow eyes, she looked at us and then, poof, red head. Eric Laneshare, Magneto, stood up. The movement was fluid, powerful. He looked down at Jubilee with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. It sounds like you have a security problem, Charles, or perhaps just an overactive imagination among your new recruits. I assure you, if there were a threat in this room, I would have crushed it already. Xavier closed his eyes for a brief moment, his temple pulsing. I sense no hostile minds in the immediate vicinity, Jubilee. The school is full of new students, many with physical mutations that could be startling. Are you certain of what you saw? I know what a special effect looks like, and this wasn't CGI, Jubilee snapped, though her confidence wavered under Eric's scrutiny. This is David, Xavier said, steering the conversation away from the accusation. He gestured to his son, who was currently scratching at his arm, muttering to himself. My son. Magneto turned his gaze to David. The air in the room grew heavier. David flinched, clutching his head. Stop it, David whispered. Stop bending the light, it hurts. He is fragile, Magneto observed, his tone unreadable. A powerful mind splintered, a pity. He is healing, Xavier corrected firmly. Eric, perhaps we should conclude our discussion later. The students seemed distressed. Magneto picked up his helmet. Very well, remember what I said, Charles. The humans are building their cages. Sword is merely the beginning. Do not let your dream blind you to the nightmare approaching. He walked past Jubilee, pausing only for a second. The zipper on her jacket slid down and then up again of its own accord. He smirked and swept out of the room. Jubilee stared at her jacket, then back at Xavier. Professor, I swear. I believe that you believe it, jubilation, Xavier said gently, rolling his wheelchair back from the desk. But I have scanned the grounds. There is no intruder. Please go get some fresh air. It has been a long day. Defeated, Jubilee grabbed David's sleeve and dragged him back into the hallway. The heavy doors clicked shut behind them, sealing away the only adult who could have helped. He didn't believe us, Jubilee fumed, kicking at the wainscoting. He thinks I'm some jittery kid scared of her own shadow. David was trembling. The metal man, he felt like static, like a broken television channel screaming white noise. David pressed his palms into his eyes. The voices didn't like him. Jack wanted to break his helmet, but I can't break things. I'm supposed to be fixing things. Come on, Jubilee sighed, softening. Let's go outside. I need to not be in this creepy castle for 5 minutes. They made their way to the courtyard, where groups of students were mingling. Jubilee pulled her yellow coat tighter around herself, feeling the chill of the autumn air. They hadn't walked 10 feet before a stream of fire erupted in front of them, forming a burning barrier. Watch your step, Sparkler, a sneering voice called out. Jubilee stopped, glaring through the flames. Leaning against a stone fountain was a boy with bleached blonde hair and a lighter flipping in his hand. St. John Allardyce. Pyro. Get out of the way, matches, Jubilee retorted, stepping around the flame. I'm not in the mood. Pyro laughed, extinguishing the fire with a wave of his hand only to shape a new flame into a mocking caricature of Jubilee's face. Here you went running to Daddy, Professor. What's the matter? Scared of the big bad upperclassmen. You freshies are all the same. Soft. Leave her alone, David mumbled, looking at the ground. Pyro turned his attention to David, his grin widening. And you, the psycho in scrubs, what's your power, huh? Drooling. You don't belong here, freak. This is a school for the gifted, not the asylum. Something inside David snapped. It wasn't a loud snap, but a deep, resonant crack in the dam holding back his fractured psyche. The stress of Magneto's presence, the dismissal by his father, and now this petty cruelty. It was too much. David's head jerked up. His eyes, usually timid and darting, were suddenly pitch black. We are not fragile. A voice that was not David's, deeper, distorted, rasped from his throat. The water in the fountain behind Pyro didn't just freeze. It vanished. In the blink of an eye, the water rematerialized directly above Pyro's head, not as liquid, but as a solid, heavy block of ice. It crashed down, shattering on the pavement inches from Pyro, soaking him and sending him sprawling backward in terror. David gasped, his eyes returning to their normal hazel hue. He stumbled back, looking at his hands in horror. I didn't. That wasn't. Pyro scrambled up, his lighter wet and useless. You're crazy. Stay away from me. He ran off toward the dorms, slipping on the wet pavement. Jubilee stared at the shattered ice, then at David. She didn't look scared. She looked impressed. Okay, she whispered, stepping closer to him. So, maybe we don't need the adults to solve this mystery after all. The adrenaline from the courtyard incident hadn't quite faded, leaving a metallic taste in Jubilee's mouth. She walked briskly down the corridor, her combat boots thumping against the polished floor, while David shuffled beside her, his hospital scrubs rustling like dry leaves. He was hugging himself, his eyes wide and fixed on the empty air ahead, muttering apologies to people Jubilee couldn't see. You gotta stop apologizing, Jubilee said, slowing her pace so he could keep up. That guy was a jerk. He deserved a little ice bath. Besides, that wasn't even you, right? It was. The other guy. David flinched, stopping near a trophy case filled with sepia-toned photographs of the original X-Men. It's not that simple, he whispered, tracing a crack in the floor tile with his toe. They aren't just other guys. They're loud, and when they take the wheel, I'm just a passenger in the trunk, the angry one. He doesn't care about consequences. He just wants to break things. Jubilee looked at him, really looked at him, stripping away the weird hair and the asylum clothes. She saw a terrified kid who had been handed a loaded gun with no safety switch. Well, the angry one saved us back there, she said softly, bumping his shoulder with hers. So tell him thanks for me, but maybe next time give me a heads up before you drop a glacier on someone. David offered a weak, trembling smile. It was the first time she had seen him look anything other than petrified. I'll try. They drifted toward the dining hall, the noise of clattering trays and teen chatter swelling as they approached. The double doors were propped open, revealing a cavernous room that felt less like a school cafeteria and more like a tactical map of a war zone. Jubilee grabbed a tray, tossing an apple onto it. So, where do the cool kids sit? Is there a chart? It is not written. A voice spoke from a puff of sulphurous smoke beside her. Jubilee jumped, sparks flying from her fingertips, but it was just Kurt Wagner, Nightcrawler. The blue-furred teenager was perched precariously on the edge of a table, his tail holding a carton of milk. He smiled, revealing pointed teeth, but his eyes were kind. Liebchen, the chart is invisible, but it is as solid as the walls, Kurt said, hopping down with acrobatic grace. He gestured with his tail toward the center tables. Observe. Jubilee followed his gaze. In the center, laughing loudly and taking up the most space, were the students with the flashy, cinematic powers. Sunspot, Roberto da Costa, sat with his feet up on a bench, holding court while soaking up the ambient light from the high windows. Pyro, dried off but still looking sour, was there too, spinning a lighter. They were beautiful, dangerous, and they knew it. That is the upper class, Kurt whispered. Energy projectors, elemental manipulators, those who can pass for human until they choose not to. He pointed a three-fingered hand toward the shadowy corners of the room. There sat students with physical mutations, scales, extra limbs, transparent skin. They ate quietly, heads down. And there are the others, those of us who cannot hide. The mutation is not just a power for us, it is a uniform we cannot take off. That's messed up, Jubilee frowned, glaring at Roberto as he tossed a grape into his mouth with arrogant flair. We're all in the same boat. Why are they acting like they own the yacht? Fear, David murmured, staring at his tray of mashed potatoes. If you look like a monster, people treat you like one. If you look like a movie star but can shoot lasers, people treat you like a god, until they get scared. Then everyone is a monster. Kurt looked at David with a solemn nod. Your friend sees the truth. Come, sit with us. The view is not as good, but the company is better. They sat at a table near the periphery. As they ate, Jubilee couldn't shake the memory of the blue woman. The way Magneto had dismissed them, the way Xavier had prioritized peace over listening, it gnawed at her. She watched the room, scanning faces. If a shapeshifter was here, they could be anyone. They could be Roberto. They could be the quiet girl with wings. I can't just let it go, Jubilee said suddenly, dropping her fork. David looked up, a dab of potato on his lip. The blue woman. The professor thinks I'm hallucinating. Magneto thinks I'm paranoid. But I know what I saw, she insisted, leaning in. She didn't just vanish, David. She had to go somewhere. She was climbing the boys' dorm wall before she came inside. That means she left footprints or scratches or something. David's eyes darted to the side as if listening to an unseen advisor. Jack says we should leave it alone. Cindy thinks it sounds like a detective game. She likes games. Listen to Cindy, Jubilee grinned. We finish eating and then we skip study hall. We're going crime scene investigation. 20 minutes later, the sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long, bruised shadows across the manicured grounds of the estate. Jubilee and David crept along the exterior wall of the east wing, the boys' dormitory. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth. Okay, Jubilee whispered, scanning the stone facade. I saw her right around. Here, second floor. She was hanging off that gargoyle like a spider. David stood back, squinting up at the architecture. The stone is disturbed, he said, his voice taking on a slightly more analytical tone, perhaps a different personality bleeding through or just keen observation. Look, the moss is scraped away. Jubilee squinted. He was right. There was a fresh, jagged line cutting through the ivy near the second-story window. Good eye. Okay, so she climbed up there, but she came down inside the building. If she left, she might have used the same route or dropped down. She scanned the ground near the foundation. The flower bed beneath the window had been recently trampled. Among the crushed hydrangeas, something caught the fading light. Bingo, Jubilee breathed, kneeling. She picked up a small, jagged shard of glass. It wasn't from a window. It was curved, thin, and tinted a dark amber. Sunglasses? David asked, peering over her shoulder. Maybe, or a vial, Jubilee mused, turning it over. It smells. Antiseptic, chemical. Like a hospital, David said, recoiling slightly. I hate that smell. Look at the dirt, Jubilee pointed. There were boot prints, heavy, military-style treads, leading away from the flower bed, disappearing into the dense shrubbery that lined the path toward the faculty garages and the maintenance sheds. She didn't fly away, Jubilee surmised. She walked, and she went that way. David looked toward the path. The shadows under the trees seemed to writhe. That goes to the teachers' quarters, and the labs. Exactly, Jubilee said, standing up and brushing dirt from her knees. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a mix of fear and vindication. The intruder isn't just breaking in, David. Whoever she is, she's comfortable here. She's heading right for where the staff lives. My dad is in there, David said, anxiety tightening his voice again. And Dr. Gray. Then we need to know where she went, Jubilee declared. She started following the faint tracks in the soft earth. Come on. If we catch her, or find out who she's pretending to be, they'll have to listen to us. They moved silently into the wooded path. The sounds of the school faded behind them, replaced by the rustle of wind in the leaves. The tracks were sporadic, hard to follow, but Jubilee's eyes were sharp. They led them deeper past the garage, toward a secondary entrance near the science wing. Suddenly, David grabbed Jubilee's arm, pulling her behind a large oak tree. SHH, he hissed, his grip surprisingly strong. What? Jubilee whispered back. Blue, David murmured, pointing a shaking finger toward the rear entrance of the science lab. I see blue. Jubilee peered around the bark. In the dim light of the doorway, a bulky, blue-furred figure was unlocking the door. It was Hank McCoy. He looked over his shoulder, his beast-like face cast in shadow, before slipping inside and shutting the door with a quiet click. Jubilee's breath hitched. Beast, but he's a teacher, he's an X-Man. He's blue, David stated simply, the logic of a child, or a madman cutting through the confusion. You said the woman was blue. Jubilee looked at the shard of glass in her hand, then at the closed door. The chemical smell, the blue skin, the path leading straight to his lab. No way, she whispered, her mind racing. It can't be him, unless the shapeshifter is pretending to be him. Or unless he's not who they say he is, David added, his eyes dark and unreadable. Jubilee gripped the glass shard tighter. We need to get closer. We need to see what he's doing in there. The service hatch to the ventilation system was located behind a dense row of rhododendrons, obscured by years of neglect and ivy. Jubilee pried the rusted grate loose with a grunt, the metal screeching a protest that made David flinch violently. Quiet, he hissed, pressing his back against the brickwork of the science wing. His eyes were squeezed shut, fingers drumming a frantic rhythm against his thighs. Cindy is screaming. She hates tight spaces. She says they smell like dead mice and electricity. Tell Cindy to put a sock in it, Jubilee whispered, brushing spiderwebs from her yellow trench coat. We're not going to a tea party. We're catching a mole. A big, blue, furry mole. She gestured for him to follow. The shaft was a rectangular throat of galvanized steel, barely wide enough for two teenagers to crawl single file. Jubilee took the lead, the faint glow of her plasmoids lighting the way like flickering sparklers. The air inside was stale, carrying the distinct, sterile scent of ozone and floor wax. Behind her, David shuffled on his elbows and knees. Every few feet, he would stop, tilting his head as if listening to a conversation happening on the other side of the metal walls. It's not just Cindy, David murmured, his voice echoing eerily in the duct. Jack thinks this is tactical. He wants to know if you have an exit strategy. Do you have an exit strategy? Yeah, Jubilee muttered, crawling over a seam in the metal. Don't get caught, that's the strategy. They moved deeper into the building's guts, guided by the vibrations of the heavy machinery housed in the science wing. The temperature began to rise, the cool night air replaced by the hum of servers and centrifuges. Eventually, light spilled through a slatted vent ahead, casting striped shadows across Jubilee's determined face. She held up a hand, signaling David to stop. Creeping forward inch by inch, she peered through the grate. Below them lay the main laboratory. It was a cathedral of chrome and glass, filled with bubbling beakers, robotic arms, and monitors displaying complex genetic sequences. In the center of the room, Hunched over a microscope like a gargoyle on a perch was Hank McCoy. From this angle he looked monstrous. His massive blue-furred shoulders were tense, muscles coiling under his lab coat. He was muttering to himself, a low, guttural growl that vibrated up the walls. In his clawed hand he held a shard of amber glass, identical to the one Jubilee had found in the flower bed. "I knew it," Jubilee breathed, her heart hammering against the aluminum floor. "He's got the evidence. He's probably trying to destroy it." David shimmied up beside her, peering through the slats. "He looks upset. The angry one doesn't like it. He says Big Blue Man feels like a storm cloud." Below, Hank stood abruptly, knocking a stool over with a clatter. He paced the room, surprisingly agile for his bulk, his movements predatory. He held the glass up to the light, growling, "Impossible. Simply impossible infiltration." "He's talking about his cover," Jubilee whispered. "He knows we're onto him." Or, a voice in David's head suggested, loud enough that he flinched physically, hitting his elbow against the duct wall with a loud thud. The sound rang out like a gunshot in the quiet lab. Hank froze. His ears swiveled and his yellow eyes snapped upward, locking instantly onto the vent grate. With a snarl, he crouched and launched himself into the air. He didn't just jump. He defied gravity, grabbing the ceiling pipes and swinging toward their hiding spot with terrifying speed. "Move," Jubilee yelled, scrambling backward. But it was too late. Hank's massive hand punched through the thin metal of the duct as if it were wet paper. He ripped the grate free, the screech of tearing metal deafening. Jubilee scrambled back, sparks flying from her hands in a panic blindingly bright in the confined space. "Who goes there?" Hank roared, hanging from the ceiling by his feet, peering into the hole. David screamed. It wasn't a normal scream. It was a harmonic distortion of reality. A wave of telekinetic force blasted outward from his forehead, hitting the ventilation shaft. The rivets popped, and the entire section of the duct groaned and collapsed. Jubilee and David tumbled down in a shower of dust and ceiling tiles, landing hard on the polished lab floor. Jubilee rolled to her feet instantly, hands glowing with destructive potential. David lay curled in a ball, clutching his head, shadows twisting around him like living snakes. "Stay back," Jubilee warned, aiming a bolt of pyrotechnic energy at the beast. "Don't think I won't roast you, furball." Hank dropped from the ceiling, landing in a crouch. He looked more confused than aggressive, adjusting his spectacles which sat askew on his nose. "Ms. Lee, Mr. Haller, what in Newton's name are you doing in my ventilation system?" "Drop the act," Jubilee shouted, though her hands trembled. "We saw the intruder, we found the glass, and now you're holding it, you're the shapeshifter." Hank blinked, standing to his full height. He looked at the shard in his hand, then back at the terrified teenagers. "Shapeshifter. Ms. Lee, I assure you, my hirsute appearance is entirely genuine, much to my tailor's dismay." "Don't lie to them." David's voice warped, deep and demonic. He stood up, but his posture was wrong, too straight, too confident. His eyes were pitch black. "We know a monster when we see one." The air in the room grew heavy, gravity seeming to fluctuate around David. Beakers began to rattle on the tables. Hank took a cautious step back, raising his palms. "David, you need to calm down. Breathe." "He's not breathing," David sneered, or the entity wearing David's face sneered. He raised a hand, and a heavy centrifuge lifted off the table, hovering ominously. Suddenly, the air filled with the smell of brimstone. Bamf! A cloud of purple smoke exploded between David and Hank. Nightcrawler materialized, his tail twitching nervously. He held a tray with a steaming teapot and 3 cups. "Main got," Kurt exclaimed, looking between the floating centrifuge and the sparking Jubilee. "I leave for 5 minutes to fetch the chamomile and you start a war." "Kurt, get back," Jubilee yelled. "Hank is the mole." Kurt looked at Hank, then at the glass shard, and chuckled nervously. "Jubilee, do not be absurd. Henry has been in the lab with me for the last 2 hours. We were discussing quantum mechanics and tea." Jubilee blinked, the sparks in her hands dimming. He was. "Indeed," Hank said gently, ignoring the floating machinery. "And this shard. I found it lodged in the exterior masonry of the danger room control box. I was analyzing the residue. It appears to be a polarized polymer used in high-grade stealth optics, not something a student would have." David's concentration faltered. The blackness receded from his eyes, replaced by confusion and fear. The centrifuge crashed to the floor, shattering. David collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. I didn't mean." Jack wanted to. Hank moved instantly, not as a beast, but as a doctor. He knelt beside David, checking his pulse with gentle, oversized fingers. It's all right, son. You're safe. The adrenaline spiked your cortisol levels. Just breathe. Jubilee lowered her hands, feeling foolish. The adrenaline drained away, leaving her legs shaky. She looked at Kurt, who was calmly pouring tea into a surviving cup, and then at Hank, whose face held no anger, only concern. I thought, Jubilee stammered, because you're blue, and she was blue. Hank sighed, a deep, rumbling sound. He looked up at her over his spectacles. A common deduction, albeit a flawed one. Pigmentation is rarely an indicator of allegiance, Ms. Lee. If it were, Kurt and I would be quite the nefarious duo. Kurt handed a cup of tea to Jubilee. He is right, Liebchen, but if someone is using stealth optics to sabotage the school, then your suspicions of an intruder were correct. You just had the wrong suspect. Jubilee took the cup, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. She looked at the hole in the ceiling, then at David, who was weeping softly while Hank rubbed his back. She realized how close they had come to hurting an ally, driven by fear and surface-level judgments. I'm sorry, Professor, Jubilee whispered. Apology accepted, Hank said, helping David stand. But we have a larger problem. If the intruder wasn't me and they used this technology. He held up the amber shard, his expression darkening. Then they are still here, and they are very well equipped. The grounds of Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters had been transformed into a kaleidoscope of autumnal hues. Orange and crimson leaves carpeted the manicured lawns, swirling around the ankles of students who were busy setting up for the annual fall festival. The scent of cinnamon, roasted nuts, and ozone hung heavy in the crisp October air. Jubilee adjusted her oversized sunglasses, blowing a bubble of pink gum as she surveyed the scene. It was a stark contrast to the sterile tension of the science lab a few nights prior. Come on, Dave, she nudged the boy beside her. You gotta admit this is pretty crash. Look at Bobby making snow cones with his bare hands. David Haller stood with his shoulders hunched, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his gray hoodie. He looked like a ghost haunting a carnival. It's loud, he murmured, his eyes darting toward a group of older students laughing near the apple bobbing station. Jack says crowds are just targets waiting to happen. Jack needs a chill pill, Jubilee said, hooking her arm through his. And so do you. We cleared Beast's name, didn't we? We're detectives, heroes practically. Now we eat pie. David offered a weak, lopsided smile. Since the incident in the ventilation shaft, he had been more withdrawn, terrified of the power that had leaked out when Hank McCoy frightened him. But Jubilee wasn't about to let him drown in his own headspace. They wandered through the stalls. Sunspot was showing off near the bonfire, heating cider with a touch of his finger, surrounded by a gaggle of adoring first-years. Kurt Wagner hung upside down from an oak tree, juggling pumpkins with his feet and tail to the delight of the younger kids. It was a slice of normal life, or as normal as a school for mutants could get. The centerpiece of the festival, however, was the Danger Room exhibition. Professor Summers had organized a public demonstration, a capture-the-flag scenario, in a holographic obstacle course projected within the gymnasium, allowing the rest of the school to watch from the bleachers. Jubilee, a voice called out. It was Banshee waving from the gym entrance. You're up next with the red team. Don't bail on us. Jubilee grinned, spitting her gum into a wrapper. Duty calls. You gonna watch David. David hesitated, then nodded. I'll be in the stands, somewhere quiet. Inside the cavernous gymnasium, the air hummed with the low thrum of the Shi'ar technology that powered the Danger Room simulations. The floor had been reconfigured into a sprawling, holographic ruins, complete with crumbling stone walls and flickering laser grids. Jubilee joined her team, a mix of younger students including Sean Cassidy. Opposite them was the blue team, led by a competitive telekinetic senior named Julian. Up in the control booth, overlooking the arena, Scott Summers stood with his arms crossed, his ruby quartz visor glinting. Beside him, acting as a student volunteer for the console, was a girl with fiery red hair and a smattering of freckles. A transfer student named Rebecca who had kept a low profile since arriving. Level 1 sequence, Scott ordered. Non-lethal stun rounds begin. The buzzer sounded. Jubilee sprinted into the holographic maze, her trench coat flapping behind her. She vaulted over a low wall, firing small bursts of pyrotechnic energy to dazzle the sensors of the opposing team's drones. Cover me, Sean yelled, unleashing a sonic scream that shattered a holographic barrier. It was fun, it was exhilarating, until the hum of the room changed pitch. A high-pitched whine pierced the air, felt in the teeth more than heard. The holographic walls flickered and then solidified with a heavy, metallic clank. The stun lasers mounted on the perimeter turrets shifted spectrum from a training yellow to a burning, lethal red. System error, Scott's voice barked over the PA, laced with sudden urgency. Abort simulation, emergency shutdown, now. In the booth, Rebecca's fingers danced over the console with unnatural speed, but she wasn't shutting it down. She was locking it out. A subtle blue ripple passed over her hand before vanishing. Down in the arena, a turret swiveled toward Jubilee. She didn't have time to process why the hologram suddenly looked like cold, hard steel. She threw up her hands, releasing a blinding display of fireworks, but the turret didn't register the distraction. It fired. A beam of searing energy tore through the stone cover she was hiding behind. Jubilee scrambled back, dust and debris raining down on her. Hey, time out. This isn't part of the show. The safety doors slammed shut, sealing the students inside. The obstacle course began to shift, the floor plates grinding together like tectonic plates. A massive slab of metal ceiling dislodged, plummeting directly toward where Jubilee lay prone. Jubilee! The scream didn't come from Sean. It came from the bleachers. David Haller had leaped the railing. He didn't run. He didn't fly. He simply was there, standing between Jubilee and the falling ton of steel. He threw his hands up, his eyes rolling back into his head, revealing glowing white voids. But it wasn't the telekinesis from before. It wasn't the ice. The air around David rippled like water disturbed by a stone. As the massive slab crashed down, it didn't crush them. Upon contact with the invisible aura erupting from David's skin, the steel transformed. Poof! The metal lost its cohesion, its atomic structure rewritten in a nanosecond. The slab exploded not into shrapnel, but into thousands of soft, white feathers. A blizzard of down rained upon them, burying Jubilee and David in a soft, harmless mound. The turret that had fired melted into a puddle of grape jelly, oozing down the wall. The gymnasium fell into a stunned silence. Even the alarms seemed to hold their breath. Scott Summers blasted the control booth door off its hinges. Though he had been standing right next to it, the lock had fused instantly. He grabbed the console, ripping the power cords free. The simulation died instantly, the remaining threats vanishing into static. Jubilee pushed herself up, spitting a feather out of her mouth. She looked at David. He was kneeling, shivering violently, clutching his chest. David, she whispered, reaching out to touch his shoulder. Did you just turn a ceiling into a pillow fight? Not me, David gasped, his voice sounding layered as if two people were speaking at once. Bleeding, the walls between the rooms in my head, they're bleeding. Teachers rushed the floor. Storm and Beast were there in seconds, checking the students for injuries. Scott was up in the booth, shouting orders to security. As Hank helped a trembling David to his feet, Jubilee brushed the feathers from her coat. She looked up toward the control booth, her heart still racing. She saw the student volunteer, Rebecca, slipping away from the chaos, blending seamlessly into the crowd of panicked onlookers. Jubilee frowned. The adrenaline was fading, sharpening her senses. A breeze from the open gym doors wafted down from the booth, carrying a scent trail left in Rebecca's wake. It wasn't perfume, it wasn't sweat. It was a sharp, sterile sting, a mix of antiseptic and ozone. Jubilee froze. Her mind flashed back to the shard of amber glass Hank had held in the lab, the residue he had called a polarized polymer. It had that exact same smell, chemical, artificial, and cold. She watched the red hair disappear around the corner of the exit. The connection clicked into place with terrifying clarity. The intruder wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. She was walking the halls, wearing the face of a classmate. That smell, Jubilee muttered, eyes narrowing behind her shades. I got you. The gymnasium was a surreal landscape of contradiction. The jagged, terrifying remnants of the malfunctioning danger room were softened by a blanket of pristine white down. Thousands of feathers drifted through the air, settling on the shoulders of stunned students and the fused wreckage of the control turrets. The silence was heavy, broken only by the whimpering of younger students and the crunch of boots on the feather-covered floor. Scott Summers stood by the destroyed console, his jaw set in a line of grim fury. He was checking the readouts on a handheld tablet, his ruby visor reflecting the chaotic scene. Beside him, Storm was already coordinating an orderly evacuation, her voice calm but commanding, cutting through the panic. Jubilee didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for the shock to wear off. She sprinted across the gym floor, her sneakers kicking up clouds of white fluff, ignoring Sean Cassidy's confused call to wait up. She vaulted over a railing and landed directly in front of Professor Summers, breathless and frantic. "It was her," Jubilee blurted out, grabbing Scott's arm. "Don't let her leave the building." Scott looked down, his expression tight. "Jubilee, calm down. We're locking down the area. We need to get everyone to safety before." "No, you're not listening," Jubilee snapped, her voice cracking with urgency. "The girl in the booth, Rebecca, she's the one." Jean Grey, having just descended from the bleachers after a telepathic sweep of the frightened crowd, stepped closer. "Jubilee, Rebecca is a transfer student. We vetted." "She smells like the glass," Jubilee insisted, pointing toward the exit where the redhead had vanished. "The amber shard me and Dave found in the lab. The one Beast said was stealth tech. Rebecca smells exactly like it, chemical, ozone, and cold. It's the same scent I smelled on the climber outside the dorms. She's the mole." Scott froze. He exchanged a sharp look with Jean. The specific detail about the scent, something only someone with Jubilee's acute senses or close proximity to the evidence would know, struck a chord. The sabotage had been manual, performed from the inside. "Jean," Scott said, his voice dropping to a tactical low. "Can you locate her?" Jean closed her eyes, her fingers pressing against her temples. I can't. There's a void. Someone was here, but their mind is shielding itself. It feels slippery, like oil on water." "That's because she's not a student," Scott growled, tapping his comms. "Bobby, lock down the perimeter. Hank, secure the exits. We have a hostile shapeshifter on the premises." Across the room, Charles Xavier wheeled himself through the sea of feathers toward David. The boy was sitting on a bench, his head in his hands, rocking back and forth. The air around him still felt charged, buzzing with the residue of the reality-altering event that had turned a ton of steel into pillow stuffing. "David," Charles said softly, placing a hand on his son's knee. David flinched, looking up with eyes that were wide and bloodshot. "I didn't mean to," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Jack wanted to smash it. Cindy wanted to hide someone else. Someone new. Just decided it shouldn't be metal anymore." Charles felt a chill run down his spine. The power to rewrite matter was an Omega-level ability, something far beyond simple telekinesis. "You saved her life, son. You did good. But we need to get you to the infirmary to stabilize your psi levels." "He's right, David," Jubilee said, reappearing at their side, though her eyes were darting around the gym. "But we have to catch her first. She knows I know. She saw me looking." "Stay with David," Scott ordered Jubilee, stepping forward. "The X-Men will handle this." "No way," Jubilee countered, her sparklers fizzing around her fingers. "I know the scent. You need a bloodhound, not just muscle. If she shifts, you won't know who she is. I will." Scott hesitated, then nodded once. "Stay behind me." The group moved swiftly into the corridor. The school was in alarm mode. Red emergency lights bathed the hallways in an ominous glow. Students were being ushered into their dorms by the prefects. "She went this way," Jubilee said, sniffing the air. The trail was fading, masked by the smell of burnt wiring and panic, but the sharp chemical tang lingered near the West Wing staircase. Toward the faculty offices. They rounded the corner and stopped dead. At the end of the hall, standing by the window, was Charles Xavier. Jubilee blinked, looking back at the man in the wheelchair behind her, then at the man standing by the window. The standing Charles smiled, a cold, predatory expression that looked wrong on the professor's kind face. "Fascinating," the standing Charles said, his voice a perfect mimicry. "I intended to leave quietly, but your security protocols are faster than anticipated." "Mystique," the real Xavier said, his voice projecting with telepathic authority. "Drop the guys, Raven. There is nowhere to run." The standing Charles chuckled. The skin rippled, blue scales washing over the Caucasian features like a tide. The tweed suit melted away into a white, skin-tight dress. Standing there now was the blue-skinned woman Jubilee had seen on the roof, her yellow eyes glowing with amusement. "Charles," Mystique purred, "you've gotten old, and your security is full of holes." "Why did you sabotage the danger room?" Scott demanded, his hand hovering near his visor. "You could have killed students." "Distraction," Mystique replied simply. "While you were playing your war games, I was uploading the files Eric needed. Cerebro schematics, the student registry. We know about the boy, Charles. We know about David." David let out a low whimper behind them. Mystique's yellow eyes locked onto him. "The son of Xavier," she mused. "Eric is quite interested in his potential. That display in the gym, magnificent. Reality is such a fragile thing, isn't it?" "Stay away from him," Jubilee shouted, stepping in front of David and raising her hands. Bright, Crackling energy balls formed in her palms. Mystique smirked. Brave little firework. Suddenly, Mystique lunged, not at them, but through the window. Glass shattered as she somersaulted 3 stories down into the courtyard below. Storm, Bobby, she's in the courtyard. Scott yelled into his comms, rushing to the broken window. Jubilee ran to the ledge and looked down. Mystique landed with impossible grace, rolling and springing to her feet. But she didn't run toward the gates. She sprinted toward the hedge maze on the south lawn. She's heading for the maze, Jubilee called out. I can stop her, David murmured. He stood up, pushing past his father's wheelchair. His posture had changed. The fear was gone, replaced by a rigid military stiffness. He rolled his neck, a sharp crack echoing in the hall. Target acquired. David, no, Charles warned, sensing the shift in his son's psyche. Let the team handle it. But David didn't listen. He raised a hand, and the air pressure in the hallway dropped violently. Below, in the courtyard, the cobblestones in front of Mystique erupted upward, forming a jagged wall of earth. Mystique didn't slow down. She leaped, shifting midair into a hawk, soaring over the barrier, then shifting back into human form as she hit the grass, disappearing into the dark entrance of the hedge maze. She's fast, Jubilee said, impressed despite herself. She is dangerous, Xavier corrected, turning his chair. Scott, Jean, take the maze. Jubilee, stay here with David. Do not engage her alone. As the teachers rushed off to intercept, Jubilee looked at David. He was staring at his hand, the military rigidity fading, replaced by the trembling, scared boy again. Did I get her? He asked, his voice small. You missed, Jubilee said gently, taking his hand. But you definitely got her attention, and I think that's what your dad is afraid of. The hedge maze on the south lawn was a sprawling, geometric beast of greenery, its towering walls casting long, jagged shadows in the moonlight. Scott Summers moved with tactical precision, his hand resting near the ruby quartz visor that held back his devastating optic blasts. Beside him, Jean Grey scanned the psychic plane, her face taut with concentration. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and the damp earth of the gardens, but the trail Jubilee had identified, that sharp, chemical tang of polarized polymer, was getting harder to track amidst the scent of pine and fear. She's shielding, Jean whispered, her voice projecting directly into Scott's mind. Her thoughts are fluid, constantly changing shape just like her body. I can't pin her down. Stay sharp, Scott commanded, signaling for Beast and Iceman to flank the left perimeter. She knows this terrain better than she should. She's had access to the danger room files. Trailing behind the senior X-Men, Jubilee gripped David Haller's arm. The boy was vibrating with a terrifying energy. His posture was no longer that of the timid, hunched teenager she had met days ago. His spine was rigid, his movements sharp and militaristic. The persona currently in the driver's seat, Jack, was scanning the hedges with the cold calculation of a veteran soldier. We shouldn't be here, Dave, Jubilee hissed, eyeing the way David's fingers twitched, as if itching for a trigger that wasn't there. Professor X said to stay put. Target remains active, David replied, his voice an octave deeper than usual, clipped and rough. Containment failed. Elimination is the only viable protocol. Whoa, pump the brakes, G.I. Joe, Jubilee said, stepping in front of him. We are not eliminating anyone. We catch her. We don't kill. David looked down at her, his mismatched eyes swirling with internal conflict. For a second, the scared boy peeked through the soldier's mask. She hurts people, Jubilee. She's going to tell them about me, about what I am. Before Jubilee could reassure him, a scream echoed from the center of the maze. It sounded exactly like Jubilee. Help, she's got me, the voice shrieked. Jubilee froze. Okay, that is just creepy. Scott and Jean bolted toward the sound, rounding a sharp corner into a central clearing adorned with a stone fountain. Standing there was Jubilee, clutching her arm, blood seeping through her fingers. But the real Jubilee was still 20 feet back with David. Scott hesitated, his hand hovering over his visor. Jubilee. The crying girl looked up, eyes wide with terror. Scott, please. Don't move, Jean shouted, her telekinetic aura flaring to life around her hands. Scott, it's a trap. Her mind, it's empty. The fake Jubilee grinned, the fear melting into a malicious sneer. Too slow, Summers. The figure lunged, shifting midair into a hulking, blue-skinned beast that mirrored Hank McCoy, slamming into Scott and knocking him into the fountain. Jean reacted instantly, shoving the imposter back with a wave of telekinetic force, but Mystique was fluid, shifting again into a lithe, serpentine form to slip through the psychic grip. Neutralizing threat, David barked from the entrance of the clearing. He raised both hands and the gravity in the clearing inverted. The water from the fountain didn't just splash. It shot upward in solid spikes of ice, aiming to impale the shapeshifter. David, stop! Jean cried out, throwing up a shield to deflect the lethal barrage. The ice shattered against her barrier, showering the clearing in diamond dust. Mystique, now back in her natural blue-skinned form, rolled to her feet near the far hedge. She held a small, encrypted data drive in her hand, the stolen files on the students, and specifically, the psychological profile of David H. Xavier. You children are volatile, Mystique taunted, her yellow eyes locking onto David. Eric will be very interested to see if you can be broken or if you're already too shattered to fix. Give it back, David growled, stepping forward. The air around him shimmered, reality bending under the weight of his anger. The hedges began to turn into twisted, metallic sculptures. Mystique didn't flinch. She simply smiled and tapped a small device on her belt. I wouldn't worry about me, little Legion. You have bigger problems descending from the sky. I just lit the beacon. A low, thrumming sound began to vibrate in their chests, growing louder by the second. The wind picked up, whipping the leaves into a frenzy. High-intensity floodlights cut through the darkness from above, blinding everyone in the maze. Unidentified mutants, a mechanically amplified voice boomed from the heavens. Stand down and surrender the fugitives. Scott scrambled to his feet, shielding his eyes. It soared. No, wait. With a deafening roar of repulsors, a sleek, heavily armored figure slammed into the earth between the X-Men and Mystique, cracking the pavement. The gray and silver armor of War Machine bristled with weaponry, all trained on the students. Flanking him, descending on wings of red and white, was the Falcon, and dropping from a stealth line was a man bearing a shield that shimmered with vibranium stars and stripes, Bucky Barnes, the current Captain America. Mystique seized the moment of chaos. As the Avengers landed, kicking up dust and confusion, she shifted into a scramble of dark feathers, mimicking a crow, and shot into the thickest part of the hedges, vanishing into the night with the drive. She's getting away, Jubilee yelled, pointing a spark-filled hand toward the retreating bird. Stand down, Bucky ordered, stepping forward, his metal arm glinting in the floodlights. Behind him, 3 more figures emerged from the shadows of the landing zone. The terrifyingly poised Spider-Woman, the earth-shaking agent known as Tremors, and a woman glowing with pure electromagnetic energy, Monica Rambeau. Professor Xavier, having navigated the garden path in his chair, rolled into the clearing, flanked by Storm and Colossus. Captain Barnes, Charles said, his voice calm but steely. To what do we owe this armed incursion on school grounds? Don't play coy, Professor, Bucky said, not lowering his shield. We received an anonymous tip with geo-coordinates. You're harboring a fugitive who put Captain Marvel in a coma. We're here for the girl, Rogue, and the accomplice, Gambit. Jubilee looked at David, who was clutching his head, the soldier persona fading back into the recesses of his fractured mind as the stress mounted. They aren't here for Mystique, she whispered, realizing the depth of the shapeshifter's play. She ratted out Rogue just to cover her own escape. This is a sanctuary, Scott said, stepping up beside the professor, his fists clenched. You have no jurisdiction here. We have a warrant from the Global Security Council, War Machine stated, his shoulder cannon whirring as it locked onto Scott. That girl is a living weapon of mass destruction. She drained Carol Danvers. We aren't leaving without her. Monica Rambeau stepped forward, her eyes glowing with power. We don't want to fight, Professor Xavier, but we will finish one if you start it. The tension in the garden was palpable, a physical weight pressing down on them all. On one side, Earth's mightiest heroes, demanding justice for their fallen comrade. On the other, the X-Men, sworn to protect their own from a world that feared them. And somewhere in the dark, Mystique was laughing, the stolen data on the most powerful mutant on Earth safely in her pocket, headed straight for Magneto. The silence in the hedge maze was heavy, suffocating, broken only by the high-pitched whine of War Machine's repulsors charging in the dark. Floodlights from the hovering Quinjet cut harsh, blinding cones through the mist, pinning the X-Men against the towering walls of greenery. Professor Charles Xavier wheeled himself forward, placing his body between the barrel of War Machine's shoulder cannon and his students. Colonel Rhodes, Captain Barnes, Xavier's voice was calm, projecting a psychic soothing balm that washed over the clearing, though the Avengers' mental shields were formidable. This is a school. These are children. Whatever grievance you have with Rogue, we can settle this without turning my garden into a battlefield. Bucky Barnes lowered his vibranium shield slightly, his eyes scanning the terrified faces of the younger students peeking out from behind Colossus. This isn't a grievance, Professor. It's containment. Rogue put Carol in a coma. If she touches anyone else, they die. We can't risk that. She didn't mean to, Jubilee shouted, stepping up beside David. Her hands crackled with pink energy, sparks dripping like molten wax onto the grass. It was an accident, just like. Jubilee, stand down, Scott Summers ordered, his hand clamped on his visor, muscles coiled tight. David Haller stood frozen. Inside his mind, the dampeners were failing. The stress of the confrontation, the blinding lights, and the aggressive posture of the armored man were cracking the walls of his psyche. They want to hurt us, whispered Cindy, her voice trembling in his right ear. Target acquired, Jack barked, overlaying a tactical grid on David's vision, highlighting the weak points in War Machine's armor. Let's play, giggled a third voice, one that sounded like tearing metal. David, Xavier said softly, sensing the psychic storm brewing behind his son's eyes. Stay with me. But it was too late. High above, Falcon swooped lower, his wings flaring to break. The sudden movement triggered a reflex in David's fractured mind. Hostile inbound, David screamed, but the voice wasn't his own. It was a guttural, distorted growl. David threw his hands up and reality screamed. The air in the garden didn't just ripple, it shattered. The floodlights overhead twisted into giant, luminous serpents made of glass and electricity, striking down at the Avengers. The ground beneath War Machine turned into a churning pool of grape jelly, sinking the heavy suit instantly to the waist. Contact, Rhodey yelled, firing a concussion blast that Storm intercepted with a gust of hurricane-force wind. The standoff dissolved into chaos. Monica Rambeau transformed into a beam of pure light, zigzagging past Iceman's frost barriers to blind Scott. Colossus roared, charging Bucky, metal clashing against vibranium with a sound like a church bell ringing in hell. David was the epicenter. He fell to his knees, clutching his head as a shockwave of telekinetic force erupted from him, knocking both Jubilee and Falcon backward. Get out of my head, David shrieked, his eyes flashing rapidly between blue, red, and pitch black. A fissure opened in the earth, but instead of magma, ticking clocks poured out, swarming toward the combatants like mechanical beetles. One attached itself to Spider-Woman's leg, aging the fabric of her suit until it turned to dust, though she kicked it away before it touched her skin. He's a reality warper, Monica shouted, rematerializing near Bucky. He's rewriting the battlefield. He's not attacking you, Jean Grey cried out, struggling to hold up a psychic umbrella to protect the students from the raining debris. He's scared. David looked up, his face twisted in a rictus of terror and rage. He saw enemies everywhere. The X-Men, the Avengers, they were all just shadows trying to lock him back in the White Room. With a howl, David thrust his palms outward. Gravity inverted. Everyone, mutant and Avenger alike, was flung upward into the night sky, flailing helplessly before slamming back down as gravity reasserted itself a second later. Jubilee scrambled through the mud, dodging a falling statue that David had inadvertently animated. She reached him, grabbing his shoulders. Dave, look at me, it's Jubes, you're safe. David looked at her, but his eyes were void black. No safe, he muttered in a child's voice. Only the monsters. He raised a hand, and the air around Jubilee began to crystallize into jagged obsidian spikes. David, no. Xavier pushed his mind into the fray, a desperate psychic lance aimed at sedating his son. But David's mind was a fortress of broken mirrors. Xavier's telepathy bounced off, reflecting back a headache that nearly threw the professor from his chair. Matthew Darling immediately erects stone walls protecting the school and the team from David's overwhelming power. Suddenly, a metal arm shot out, grabbing David's wrist before the spikes could launch. Bucky Barnes stood there, not attacking but holding firm. The obsidian shards hovered, trembling. Let him go. Jubilee raised a fist, ready to blast Bucky. Wait, Bucky said, his voice surprisingly gentle, cutting through the din of the battle raging behind them. He looked directly into David's void-black eyes. Alpine, the goldfish. You remember Alpine. David blinked. The blackness in his eyes receded, revealing a sliver of confused blue. The obsidian spikes turned into black flower petals and drifted harmlessly to the ground. Who? David stammered, the soldier persona Jack fading, leaving the confused boy exposed. The asylum, Bucky said, ignoring War Machine who was struggling to free himself from the jelly pit. The White Room with no doors. Nightmare put us there. Me, you, and Mark. David's breathing hitched. The chaotic wind swirling around them died down. Mark. Mark Spector, Bucky said, maintaining eye contact, grounding the boy. Moon Knight, remember what he told us. When the walls start breathing, when the voices get too loud. David's lip trembled, tears cut tracks through the dirt on his face. He said the mind is a suit, David whispered, clutching his chest. And sometimes you have to change the tie. Bucky nodded, slowly releasing David's wrist. You're wearing the wrong tie right now, kid. You're panicked. You're letting the fear drive. You need to switch back, take the wheel. I can't, David sobbed. They're too loud. Yes, you can, Xavier said, rolling closer, his voice aligning with Bucky's calming influence. Focus on my voice, David. Focus on the captain's metal arm. It is real. The monsters are not. Jubilee squeezed David's other hand. I'm right here, Dave. I'm not going anywhere. The floating clocks dissolved into mist. The jelly solidified back into dirt, trapping War Machine's legs but stopping the sinking. The battle around them faltered as the combatants realized the source of the chaos was powering down. David collapsed forward, exhausted, catching himself on Bucky's chest. Captain America caught him, looking over the boy's head at Xavier. There was a flicker of recognition, a shared understanding of broken minds and the struggle to piece them back together. Stand down, Bucky shouted over his shoulder to his team. I said stand down, the kid is secure. Silence returned to the garden, broken only by the heavy breathing of the X-Men and the hum of powered armor. But the peace was fragile. High on the mansion's balcony, unnoticed during the psychic maelstrom, two figures stepped out of the shadows. One wore a trench coat, holding a glowing staff. The other wore green and yellow, looking down with a heavy heart. Rogue and Gambit had seen enough. The garden was silent, save for the settling of disturbed earth and the hum of cooling repulsors. High above the hedge maze, where the moonlight caught the edge of the stone balcony, Rogue stood with her hands raised. The green and yellow of her uniform was stained with soot, and her expression was one of exhausted resignation. Beside her, Gambit leaned on his glowing staff, his trench coat billowing slightly in the wind, eyes narrowed and dark with protective defiance. That's enough, Rogue called down, her southern drawl cutting through the tension like a knife. She floated down slowly, landing between the X-Men and the Avengers. I ain't gonna let a child tear his mind apart just to keep me free. If you want me, Colonel, I'm yours. Cheer non, Gambit hissed, stepping up beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. We go together, but we don't surrender to tin men. War Machine finally managed to free his legs from the solidified soil that had been grape jelly moments prior. He raised his gauntlet, the repulsor whining as it charged. Anna-Marie Lebeau, Remy Lebeau, you are under arrest for the assault on Captain Marvel and violation of the Sokovia Accords. Wait, the voice didn't come from the soldiers nor the mutants. It projected directly into their minds, firm yet gentle, like a father guiding a wayward hand. Professor Charles Xavier rolled forward, his wheelchair crunching over the debris of the battle. Colonel Rhodes, Xavier spoke aloud, his eyes shifting to Bucky Barnes. You came here for justice, not war. You have seen what happens when these young minds are pushed into corners. David nearly leveled this estate because he was afraid. Taking Rogue by force will only prove his fears correct. Bucky looked down at his metal arm, then back at David, who was currently wrapped in a shock blanket, leaning heavily against Jubilee. The Winter Soldier saw the trembling boy, not a weapon. What are you suggesting, Professor? A compromise, Xavier said, clasping his hands. Rogue and Gambit will remain here, confined to the estate grounds. They will serve as instructors and guardians for the student body, community service, if you will. I will personally vouch for their conduct and ensure they are available for questioning regarding the incident with Ms. Danvers. They will be X-Men under my watch, not fugitives on the run. Rhodes scoffed, opening his faceplate. You think the council is going to accept house arrest at a prep school? They will if Captain America tells them it's the only way to prevent an Omega-level catastrophe, Xavier said softly, looking directly at Bucky. You know what it is to be a weapon against your will, James. Help me give them a chance to be people. Bucky held Xavier's gaze for a long moment. He looked at Rogue, who had lowered her head, waiting for the cuffs. He looked at David, who offered a weak, timid wave. Stand down, Rhodes, Bucky said, holstering his weapon. We're leaving. Barnes, you can't be serious, Rhodes protested. I trust him, Bucky said, nodding at Xavier. We have the data drive mystique left behind. No, but we have peace. Let's not break it. He turned to the professor. Keep them close, Doc. If she steps out of line, I come back. And next time I won't be talking about goldfish. The seasons turned, painting the Westchester grounds in shades of russet and gold. then burying them under a pristine blanket of white, and finally, melting into the vibrant green of spring. The damage to the garden was repaired, the hedge maze regrown thicker than before. For Jubilee, the months passed in a blur of exams, combat drills, and late-night pizza runs. The fear that had gripped the school during the fall festival had faded, replaced by the mundane dramas of teenage life. She sat on the stone steps of the library, watching Sunspot show off his solar flare soccer moves to a group of impressed freshmen. "You're staring again," a voice murmured beside her. Jubilee jumped, sparks fizzing from her fingertips. David was sitting there, a thick psychology textbook in his lap. He looked better, healthier. The scrubs were gone, replaced by a vintage band t-shirt and jeans. His hair was still tall, but he wore it with confidence now, not neglect. "I wasn't staring," Jubilee lied, popping a piece of gum. "I was observing, tactical assessment." David smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "Right, tactical. How's the control training with Banshee?" "Loud. Sean says I have the pipes of a banshee but the rhythm of a brick." She nudged him. "What about you? Jean said you made a breakthrough." David tapped his temple. "The walls are stronger. Jack and Cindy. They're still there, but we have a schedule now. Negotiation. It's not perfect, but it's quiet." Jubilee leaned back on her elbows, soaking in the sun. Quiet is good. Boring, but good. Across the lawn, Rogue walked with Gambit, pointing out structural weaknesses in the gazebo to a group of architecture students. She wore gloves, but she looked lighter, the burden of the chase lifted. The school was safe. They were safe. 2 months later, the air was crisp near the frozen lake at the edge of the estate. Professor Xavier sat in his chair, a tartan blanket over his legs, watching a chess board set up on a portable table. He made his move, a knight taking a pawn, and waited. "You still favor the aggressive opening, Charles." Eric Laneshare stepped out from the tree line. He wore a dark wool coat, no helmet, his hands deep in his pockets. He didn't look like Magneto, the terrorist. He looked like an old friend coming to visit. "And you still arrive unannounced, Eric," Charles replied without looking up. "Please sit." Magneto sat on the stone bench opposite him. He stared at the board, then at the mansion in the distance. "Mystique tells me the boy is progressing, that his power is stabilizing." "David is doing well," Charles said sharply. "He is happy. He has friends. He is not a weapon for your brotherhood, Eric. He is my son." "He is a god among ants, Charles, and you are teaching him to be a gardener." Eric moved a bishop, his eyes flashing with intensity. "I have the files Mystique retrieved. I know his potential. I will not let that power go to waste. When the time is right, I will come for him." Charles stopped his hand over the board. He looked up, his blue eyes hard as steel. "No, you won't. You cannot stop me. Your X-Men are children. Your Avengers allies are fickle. I don't need to fight you, Eric. I have a trade." Magneto laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "What could you possibly offer me? I have resources, I have followers, I have the future." "I have your children." The wind seemed to die down instantly. The metal chess pieces rattled on the board. Eric's face went pale. "My children died in Sokovia, with Magda. I buried the empty caskets myself." "They did not die," Charles said softly, his voice full of a terrible, heavy truth. "They were found, adopted, a boy and a girl, twins." Eric stood up, the bench scraping loudly against the stone. "You're not lying. I could not lie to you about this. I have known for some time, ever since what happened to Westview. I helped her avoid detection after her time studying with Dr. Strange. I want to help you reunite with your daughter. But if you persist in your pursuit of David, if you drag my son into your war, I will ensure you never find her." Magneto's hands trembled, the magnetic fields around them warping the air, bending the light. "Who is she?" Charles leaned back. "Leave David alone, delete the files, forget he exists, and I will give you the name." Eric stared at his old friend, a war of emotions playing out in his eyes, rage, hope, grief. Finally, he sat back down. The tension in the air dissipated. "Done," he whispered. "The boy is yours, tell me." Charles projected a single image into Eric's mind. A young woman with scarlet energy dancing around her fingers. "Her name is Wanda Maximoff," Charles said. "She's alive, Eric. But be careful, Eric, her mind is unstable, possibly more than my son." A single tear traced a path down the master of magnetism's cheek. He looked at the chessboard, at the game he had just lost, and realized he had won something far greater. "Checkmate, Charles," Eric murmured. "Checkmate, old friend."